The moment Judge Joe Brown lost control, millions watching knew something historic was about to happen. His voice, once synonymous with courtroom authority, now cracked with anger as he leaned forward, his words ricocheting like a gavel slammed. In rage, cameras captured every twitch of his jaw, every syllable spat with the force of a man clinging to a power that no longer held sway. The audience froze. Some gasped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A ripple of disbelief traveled through the room, the kind of collective shock that makes even seasoned observers wonder if they had just witnessed the end of someone's legacy. Brown wasn't debating, he was shouting, hands gesturing wildly, his composure unraveling before the world. It wasn't just volume that made the moment unforgettable. It was the condescension dripping from his tone, the old guard arrogance of a man who thought raising his voice could silence an opponent. The clash wasn't about policy anymore, it was about dignity, about whether respect could survive in a room drenched with rage. Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, eyes steady, posture unshaken. While Brown's words filled the air like smoke, Crockett cut through with silence, refusing to flinch, refusing to shrink. Every second she stayed calm turned the spectacle into a mirror. One man, loud and flailing, one woman, silent and unbothered. The contrast was undeniable. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another televised shouting match, it was the unraveling of an image, the crumbling of authority when met with unmovable composure. And in that silence, Crockett gathered something more powerful than any insult. Anticipation, because when a man shouts, the world may hear noise. But when a woman answers, the world remembers her words. The air thickened with suspense, every eye locked on Crockett, waiting for her response. The old playbook of intimidation had been thrown down on the table, but the next move wasn't Brown's to make, it was hers. And as the tension reached its breaking point, one truth became clear. Whatever came out of Jasmine Crockett's mouth next would define the moment forever. But Jasmine Crockett's response, no one saw it coming. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to look beyond the shouting. This wasn't just Judge Joe Brown raising his voice at a congresswoman. It was a generational clash, a test of respect, and a battle over who gets to define dignity in America. Joe Brown had built a reputation over decades, stripped-dunged, unapologetically old school, a man whose authority was unquestioned in the era of his courtroom fame. He embodied a time when shouting could silence, when a booming voice could command unquestioned obedience. For some, he was a figure of nostalgia. For others, a relic of a harsher, less forgiving era. His confidence was his brand, but so too was his arrogance. Enter Jasmine Crockett, rising star, unapologetic truth-teller, and a woman unafraid of confrontation. She didn't inherit her platform, she fought for it. A lawyer turned congresswoman, she carved her name not through deference to tradition, but by challenging it. Where Brown leaned on the authority of the past, Crockett drew strength from the urgency of the present. For her, every word spoken in these moments wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about representing those who had too often been dismissed, talked over, or shouted down. That's why this confrontation was electric. It wasn't two voices clashing, it was two eras colliding. Brown's thunderous shouting wasn't just personal frustration. It was symbolic of an old guard desperately trying to hold its ground against a wave of new voices demanding space, demanding respect. Crockett's refusal to bend under that pressure wasn't just personal dignity, it was defiance on behalf of everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. Viewers at home felt it. Social feeds lit up with instant reactions. Clips circulated before the debate even ended. People saw more than just a man losing his temper. They saw a woman embodying calm in the storm. They saw power without screaming, confidence without chaos, and the stakes became clear. This wasn't going to fade into obscurity. It was destined to be replayed, shared, analyzed, and remembered. Because Crockett wasn't just answering for herself. She was standing as a proxy for a new America, diverse, unapologetic, unwilling to bow to outdated authority. And Brown, whether he realized it or not, had placed himself on the opposite side of that struggle. Every second the exchange continued. The tension grew. Would Crockett finally crack under the weight of Brown's volume? Would she fire back in kind, lowering herself to the level of the man shouting at her? Or would she find a way to seize the moment and turn his aggression into her strength? The answer would shape not only the arc of this debate but the trajectory of both figures in the eyes of the public. For Brown, this was a gamble with his reputation. For Crockett, this was a chance to step fully into the national spotlight. And just when it seemed Brown had the upper hand, the energy in the room shifted. To understand why Joe Brown's shouting carried so much weight and why his unraveling was so shocking, you have to step back into the story of who he was before this moment. Judge Joe Brown wasn't always the man red-faced with anger on a stage. For decades, he was a household name, a figure whose booming voice carried the authority of law itself. He presided not only over cases but over living rooms across America, his syndicated courtroom show drawing millions of viewers. At his height, Brown was celebrated for his blunt style. He wasn't just a judge, he was an entertainer. His rulings came laced with moral lectures, his sentences delivered with the flair of a performer who knew every camera angle was his. People tuned in for the drama, for the fire in his words, for the sense that here was a man unafraid to say what others wouldn't. His fame was built on a persona, no nonsense, sharp-tongued, fiercely commanding. But over time, what once felt refreshing began to feel outdated. The very traits that made him famous, the shouting, the belittling, the iron fist disguised as wit started to crack under modern scrutiny. Critics pointed out the contradictions: a man who demanded respect while often refusing to give it, a figure who preached dignity but relied on humiliation as spectacle. The same bark that once commanded attention started to sound like noise. In an era craving empathy, not intimidation. Still, Brown clung to the image of himself as the ultimate authority. Off camera, he cultivated a reputation for being uncompromising, opinionated, and, some would say, egotistical. In interviews, he doubled down on old views, often sparking controversy. His fans defended him as brutally honest, but his detractors saw arrogance, even cruelty. So when he stepped onto that stage opposite Jasmine Crockett, he carried decades of reputation on his shoulders. To many, he represented a dying breed of power, the kind that believed volume equaled truth, that respect was owed rather than earned. His presence was almost theatrical, the elder statesman, battle-tested and unyielding, ready to put a younger challenger in her place. And yet, beneath the bravado was something fragile. That night, the old tactics faltered. His shouting didn't silence the room. It unsettled it. Instead of reinforcing his authority, it exposed its hollowness. The louder he grew, the clearer it became that he was fighting not just Crockett, but time itself, an era that no longer bowed to intimidation. For the audience watching, the unraveling felt overdue. How many times had they seen men like Brown dominate a room simply by raising their voices? How many times had dignity been drowned out by arrogance? Intelligence dismissed under the weight of a shout? In Brown's eruption, they saw the old playbook laid bare. And in his trembling jaw, they sensed something even more dramatic, the beginning of his downfall. The irony was undeniable. For years, Brown had been the one humiliating others on camera. He had built his brand on turning moments of weakness into entertainment. But now, it was his own anger providing the spectacle. The man who had once wielded humiliation like a weapon was now teetering on the edge of becoming its victim. That's why this confrontation carried so much electricity. It wasn't just about Crockett's composure. It was about the collective realization that the old way, the shouting, the intimidation, the arrogance was finally losing its grip. People weren't just watching a debate. They were watching a changing of the guard. And for Joe Brown, whose entire persona depended on control, the prospect of losing it was devastating. His shouts weren't just words. They were the echoes of a man desperate to reclaim authority slipping through his fingers. But his trademark bravado was about to meet a challenger unlike any he'd faced. If Joe Brown carried the weight of a bygone era, Jasmine Crockett carried something entirely different, the spirit of resilience. The proof of what it means to rise in a system built to keep you out. Her journey was not paved with TV contracts or nostalgic fame. It was carved through grit, sweat, and the relentless determination of a woman who refused to be silenced. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett knew early on what it meant to stand out, and more importantly, to stand up. She didn't come from privilege. She built her name brick by brick, first through education, then through law, and finally through politics. Every step of the way, she encountered the same barriers so many women of color know too well: skepticism, disrespect, and the ever-present hum of doubt cast upon her abilities. But what set her apart was the way she treated those obstacles. For Crockett, every slight, every underestimation, became fuel. In courtrooms, she stood firm against those who tried to talk over her. On campaign trails, she faced criticism not with apologies, but with unapologetic clarity. She learned to transform pressure into presence, to meet hostility not with fear, but with fire contained in calm. As a lawyer, Crockett defended the vulnerable. She didn't chase easy cases or comfortable wins. She took on the fights that mattered, the ones where dignity was at stake, where justice was on the line. That sharpened her edge. She learned how to read aggression, how to measure silence, how to strike when the moment was right. When she stepped into politics, she carried that same defiance. Her speeches were not polished for perfection, but raw with authenticity. She spoke with the cadence of someone who knew struggle firsthand, and audiences felt it. She didn't try to blend into the marble halls of power. She brought her whole self, her identity, her unapologetic truth. For her supporters, she became a symbol, proof that voices once shut out of the room could not only enter but command it. That authenticity also brought criticism. She was labeled too brash, too bold, too unrefined for the political establishment. Yet what her critics called flaws, her supporters recognized as courage. Every attack only confirmed what she had always known, that the world was not waiting to hand her respect. She would have to claim it, and in claiming it, she made space for others to do the same. So when Crockett found herself across from Joe Brown, it wasn't just another debate. It was a lifetime of preparation meeting a moment of destiny. For years, she had been sharpening the very skill Brown underestimated, the ability to stay composed while fire was hurled her way. She had endured insults from colleagues, dismissals from opponents, patronizing tones from those who thought they held the power. Each time, she had stayed rooted, refusing to let others dictate the terms of her worth. Brown's shouting, then, was nothing new. It was simply louder, more public, more desperate. But Crockett had already faced that sound before in courtrooms, where clients' lives hung in the balance. In political arenas, where her very presence was treated as disruption. To her, this wasn't chaos, it was confirmation. Confirmation that she had struck a nerve, that her presence alone was enough to unsettle someone who thought volume equaled victory. That's why she didn't flinch. That's why her silence felt louder than his shouting. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman being yelled at. She was the embodiment of every person who had ever sat quietly while someone tried to dominate the room with noise. She was proof that dignity can be more powerful than decibels. And yet, Crockett knew composure alone wasn't enough. A storm like Brown's couldn't be met only with silence. To win this moment, to truly turn it into something unforgettable, she would need to do what she had always done: wait for the perfect opening, then strike with precision. Her backstory mattered because it made her ready. She wasn't rattled because she had lived rattling moments 1,000 times before. She wasn't intimidated because intimidation was an old song she had stopped dancing too long ago. She wasn't silent because she lacked words. She was silent because she was calculating, preparing, holding her strength until the exact right second to release it. And when the moment came, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she turned the attack into a masterclass. The room was already buzzing from the shock of Joe Brown's eruption, but as the minutes passed, the atmosphere thickened into something nearly unbearable. Each time Brown raised his voice, his tone seemed sharper, his words more desperate, as if volume could mask the unraveling of his control. He jabbed at Crockett with interruptions, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had once wielded effortlessly on television. But the effect was different now. The audience wasn't impressed. They were uneasy. You could see it in the shifting eyes, the uncomfortable murmurs, the way the crowd leaned forward, not in admiration, but in suspense. It wasn't respect filling the air, it was disbelief. Crockett, however, didn't mirror his energy. She didn't match his decibels. Instead, she leaned into composure like a shield. Each time he cut her off, she paused. Each time he barked over her words, she sat a little taller, her eyes fixed, her lips pressed into a calm line that read louder than any outburst. The silence became her ally, and in that silence, she drew the audience's sympathy. Still, the tension kept rising. Brown gestured broadly, pounding the table at one point to drive his message home. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Some gasped, some winced, and all the while, Crockett remained still, refusing to be rattled. It was cinematic in its rhythm, Brown throwing heat, Crockett absorbing it without flinching. Like a storm crashing against a cliff, each wave of his fury broke apart against her stillness. You could feel the shift beginning, not in Brown's words, but in the crowd's perception. Authority wasn't in the shouting anymore, it was in the restraint. Then came the tipping point. Brown launched into a tirade, his voice cracking, his face reddening, the cadence slipping from measured rhetoric into pure rage. He leaned forward as if proximity could force submission. It was spectacle at its peak. A man who once defined control, now defined by its absence. And still, Crockett waited. Patient, unshaken. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was preparation. Those who knew her style could see it, the gathering energy, the calculation behind her steady gaze. She wasn't absorbing his attack for lack of words. She was holding her words like a blade, waiting for the exact second to unsheath it. The audience sensed it too. Phones raised higher, cameras locked in. The tension wasn't just about Brown's shouting anymore. It was about the inevitable moment when Crockett would finally answer. Viewers leaned forward, pulses quickening, eyes darting between the aggressor and the poised figure who refused to break. The storm had reached its height. Brown's voice filled every corner of the room, but his dominance was an illusion. Everyone knew it couldn't last. Something was coming. Something sharp, something final. The crowd thought she'd stay silent. Instead, she unleashed the line that flipped the room. For minutes, Jasmine Crockett had sat through the storm, measured, unshaken, letting Joe Brown's fury expend itself like thunder rolling across the night sky. He had shouted, interrupted, gestured wildly, each outburst meant to dominate. But when she finally opened her mouth, the room felt it. The air itself seemed to tighten. The silence that followed her voice, almost louder than his shouting had been. Her tone was steady, deliberate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With surgical precision, she began, not by addressing his insults directly, but by dismantling the very foundation of his approach. When men think shouting equals respect, she said, eyes locked on him, they prove they never really earned it. The line sliced through the room like glass breaking. A ripple of gasps swept across the audience. Some leaned back in their seats, others covered their mouths, stunned by the audacity. Brown froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everyone watching to register the shift. She didn't stop there. Crockett pressed forward with calm authority, layering her counterattack piece by piece. She framed his shouting not as strength but as weakness, exposing it as insecurity cloaked in volume. If your argument had substance, she continued, you wouldn't need to yell it. You'd let the truth speak for itself. The crowd erupted. Cheers, claps, murmurs. It was no longer his stage, it was hers. And Brown, for all his bluster, suddenly looked smaller. His shoulders shifted, his eyes darted, his voice caught in his throat as he tried to recover. But each attempt to interject only made him appear more desperate. Crockett let the reaction wash over the room before delivering her next strike. She leaned slightly forward, her voice lower, forcing everyone to lean in to catch her words. You don't intimidate me, Judge. You remind me of every man who thought shouting could erase the facts. And just like them, you'll find out you're wrong. It was a masterclass in timing. She spoke not in paragraphs but in phrases, each one landing like a hammer, leaving just enough space for the audience to react before moving to the next. The rhythm was intoxicating Brown's fury, collapsing against her precision, like fire against water. For viewers at home, the moment was electrifying. Social media lit up instantly, hashtags forming mid-sentence, clips being clipped and shared before she even finished. You could almost hear the typing frenzy across the country. Crockett just ended Joe Brown. On stage, the effect was even more dramatic. Brown tried to fire back, but every interruption only dug him deeper. Where his words were rushed, hers were measured. Where his tone cracked, hers remained even. And where he looked rattled, she looked unshakable. It was the visual of control meeting chaos, and chaos losing. The camera caught it perfectly. The tightening of Brown's jaw, the twitch in his temple, the subtle slump in his posture. Gone was the commanding judge, who once controlled a courtroom with a gavel and glare. In his place stood a man visibly shaken, his authority bleeding out with every second Crockett held the floor. And then came the finishing blow, their moment destined to be replayed endlessly. Crockett paused, letting the room quiet again, before saying, respect isn't shouted into existence. It's earned by listening, by standing on truth. If you can't do that, maybe it's time you stop calling yourself honorable. The crowd exploded. Some leaped to their feet. Phones shook as they tried to capture the scene. The eruption wasn't just about her words, it was about the release of tension, the catharsis of watching dignity triumph over arrogance in real time. Brown tried to mask his reaction, but the damage was irreversible. His face betrayed him, the clenched jaw, the forced half-smile that couldn't hide his embarrassment. For a man who built a career on commanding respect, being publicly dismantled by someone younger, sharper, and calmer was devastating. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't gloat. She didn't raise her arms in victory or smirk. She sat back, composed, as if to prove that what she had done wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth. That composure made the takedown even more powerful. She had delivered the knockout without ever breaking her calm. The audience, both in the room and online, felt the moment transcend the debate itself. It wasn't just Crockett versus Brown anymore. It was the embodiment of a larger struggle between dignity and arrogance, between new voices and old authority, between calm truth and loud bluster, and everyone watching knew who had won. For days afterward, clips of the exchange circulated. The hashtags told the story. Hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag Joe Brown regret, hashtag respect over rage. Memes flooded timelines. Commentators framed it as the perfect generational clash, the moment when shouting gave way to substance. Even celebrities chimed in, praising Crockett for her poise under fire. But inside that room, in that moment, none of the ripple effects had happened yet. All that existed was silence, Brown staring at Crockett, Crockett meeting his gaze without flinching, and an audience roaring with validation. The mic drop wasn't just a line. It was a turning point, a seismic shift that left no doubt about who had truly commanded the stage. But the fallout didn't stop in that room. It ignited a firestorm across the nation. The second Jasmine Crockett's words hit the air, the ripple effect began. Within minutes, the clip was sliced, captioned, and launched across every social media platform. What had been a heated debate in one room became the conversation of an entire country. On Twitter, hashtags like hashtag Crockett clapback and hashtag Joe Brown regret shot to the top of the trending list. Users replayed the moment over and over, each viewing sharper than the last. She ended him without raising her voice, one post declared, racking up tens of thousands of likes in hours. Another simply captioned the video, "This is what dignity looks like when arrogance comes for it." TikTok stitched her line into countless edits, slow motion, zoom-ins, dramatic background music. The clip turned from a political exchange into a cultural moment. Young viewers mimicked her calm stare, using her line as a new anthem for pushing back against disrespect. Instagram Reels spread the same imagery. Crockett, unflinching, while Brown's shouting seemed to collapse under its own weight, jumped in. Cable news panels replayed the moment with wide-eyed hosts shaking their heads in disbelief. Late-night comedians turned Brown's outburst into punchlines, framing him as a caricature of outdated power. Meanwhile, Crockett's restraint was elevated as a blueprint for handling aggression with grace. Celebrities weighed in, too. Actors, athletes, and activists praised her composure, calling it the perfect embodiment of strength without noise. For many, it became more than a debate, it was a metaphor for generational change. For women holding their ground in spaces historically dominated by men who shouted first and listened later. But the reactions weren't just online. In communities, across the country, people felt seen. Women who had endured condescension in boardrooms, immigrants who had been shouted over in classrooms, young professionals dismissed as inexperienced until they proved otherwise. Crockett's moment became their moment. She wasn't just a politician in that instant, she was a stand-in for everyone who had been told to sit down and stay quiet. Brown, on the other hand, became the subject of ridicule. Memes portrayed him red-faced and rattled, captions mocking his outdated bravado. Headlines didn't just describe Crockett's victory, they highlighted his loss. Joe Brown shouted. Jasmine Crockett spoke. One editorial read. Another was even more blunt. Respect doesn't live here anymore. Judge. And yet, beneath the mockery, there was something heavier, sense that his time as a cultural authority had finally expired. The man who once held a nation's attention with his gavel and booming voice was now remembered for being dismantled in real time, undone not by a louder opponent but by one who refused to play his game. For Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Overnight, she became more than just a rising congresswoman. She became a symbol. Supporters flocked to her pages, flooding them with messages of gratitude. Donations spiked. Interviews poured in. Suddenly, she wasn't just participating in the conversation, she was the conversation. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about culture, about identity, about dignity. Crockett's words traveled beyond party lines and into the hearts of anyone who had ever wanted to believe that composure could be stronger than chaos. The night had started as a debate, but in the days that followed, it became something else. Entirely. A story replayed in living rooms, shared in text threads, debated in classrooms. People weren't just watching the clip, they were living through it, applying it to their own lives, holding on to it as proof that arrogance doesn't always win. Yet beyond the viral moments, a deeper lesson was unfolding. When the dust settled, it became clear this clash was never really about two individuals. It was about what they represented. Joe Brown's shouting embodied a world where dominance was measured in decibels, where respect was demanded but rarely given. Jasmine's composure, her calm counterattack, embodied something far larger, the truth that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. Crockett reframed the entire confrontation into a lesson that resonated far beyond the debate stage. By staying poised, by refusing to be dragged into chaos, she showed that dignity is not weakness, it is power. For women who had ever been shouted down, 4 immigrants told their voices didn't belong, 4 young people dismissed as inexperienced, her moment was proof that composure can be revolutionary. In the quiet after Brown's fury, Crockett's words rang louder than any insult he hurled. She transformed his aggression into a mirror that reflected his insecurity, while her restraint reflected strength. That reversal was more than a clever clapback, it was a moral victory. It said, you don't defeat disrespect by echoing it. You defeat it by outlasting it, by showing the world that arrogance eventually consumes itself. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed. Commentators framed the exchange as a generational turning point, a cultural reset. Crockett wasn't just responding to Brown. She was speaking to a nation still struggling with questions of identity, respect, and equality. She took a moment dripping with negativity and turned it into a testament to values that progressives hold dear: justice, resilience, and the audacity to stand unflinching in the face of contempt. And yet, the lesson was universal. Anyone who watched could see themselves in it. A teacher silenced in staff meetings, a worker ignored in boardrooms, a young activist told to sit down. Crockett's composure was their vindication. Her words reminded them that dignity is not about silence, it's about choosing the right moment to speak. And when you do, letting truth carry more weight than noise ever could. The clash ended not with Crockett shouting louder, but with her proving that arrogance always reveals itself, while dignity always endures. It was a story about politics, yes, but also about something more timeless. The human need to be heard, respected, and seen for who we are. She didn't just clap back for herself, she did it for everyone who's ever been shouted down. For everyone who's ever felt drowned out by the thunder of arrogance. She was lightning, sharp, and unforgettable. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the noise fades. Judge Joe Brown may have entered the debate with a booming voice and a lifetime of reputation, but he left with something far heavier: regret. His shouting, once a symbol of authority, now lingers as a reminder of arrogance undone. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, walked away with more than applause. She walked away with a legacy moment. The kind of defining clash that elevates a figure from participant to symbol. Because what unfolded wasn't just political theater, it was a moral reckoning. It was proof that arrogance, no matter how loud, will always crumble when faced with dignity and truth. Crockett showed us that composure isn't weakness, it's strategy. That silence isn't surrender, it's preparation. And when the time came, Her words didn't just win a debate, they gave a voice to millions who have waited for moments like this. But the story doesn't end here. Moments like these live on because people like you carry them forward. Every share, every conversation, every replay of that clip ensures that dignity is celebrated, not drowned out. If this moment made you feel something, pride, validation, hope, don't let it stop here. Subscribe, share, and be part of the community that refuses to bow to arrogance, that insists on lifting up voices of truth. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett or Joe Brown. It was about all of us. It was about the America we're shaping not through shouting, but through courage, through clarity, through the unwavering demand for respect. And that's why when history looks back, it won't remember the noise. It will remember the moment. Dignity spoke louder. Because in moments like this, it's not just about politics, it's about who we choose to be.